Hey everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat, your one-stop shop for everything going on in the world of Formula One. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and today we are going through a race that, quite frankly, could have been an email. Formula One was racing in Japan this weekend at the Suzuka circuit, and honestly, I know most of the chatter about this race is that it was quite boring. And frankly, yeah, I have to agree, this was probably one of the least interesting races we've had in a while. Most of the interesting parts come from the things that happened before the race itself, the drama that is kind of unfolding when it comes to the season and the teams and where everyone stands, and also radio messages. That was a big highlight of this race week. All of that being said, even though it wasn't the most interesting race itself, there was some good stuff that we should talk about, recap, and break down. Because even though this was a little bit of a lull, ahead of the race week was probably some of the most drama that we were not expecting to see, especially this early on. So before we get into the race itself, let's talk a little bit about what was going on before we got to Suzuka. Obviously, the big talk of this week comes down to Liam Lawson and Yuki Tsunoda being swapped. This driver swap is something that I think you always potentially expect when it comes to the Red Bull camp. Red Bull has two teams, Red Bull Racing and VCarb. And it has been the case for a very long time that those teams kind of function as a singular family, always serving the needs of Red Bull Racing as the bigger team. Drivers come from the Red Bull Racing Academy, go into the junior team, and move up to the senior team, hopefully. But we've also seen a number of driver swaps, and this is not the first time we've seen one that felt particularly brutal. When it comes to a history of driver swaps, even if we don't go particularly far back, and we just start with Max Verstappen himself, we have seen a ton of driver swaps and drops from Red Bull as a whole, just in this Max Verstappen era. Especially when you look at how this all started, Max himself actually was a driver who was moved up mid-season, replacing someone else. Max started his Formula One career with the junior team, which now is known as VCarb, and he was moved up mid-season because the driver that was currently paired with Daniel Ricciardo was not performing to the best of the abilities Red Bull was looking for. That obviously ended up panning out to be a pretty good decision. But since then, when it comes to Max's teammates, we have seen him go through a number of them. When Max was promoted originally, his teammate was Daniel Ricciardo, someone that I think this era of Formula One fans know and love. And while Daniel Ricciardo was not dropped, he ultimately became uncomfortable with the fact that he was moving into that second driver space. We know now that Max was obviously heading towards world championships, but Daniel Ricciardo himself had been the mainstay of that team. And so as we saw Max rising and the next generation of talent coming, Daniel decided to leave to find somewhere else that he could be the main focus. When Daniel made that move, he was replaced by another familiar name from the current grid, Pierre Gasly. Pierre at the time was on the junior team, and when he got that promotion up to the main seat, Alex Albon actually got his shot in Formula One with that junior team seat that was opened up by Pierre. However, Pierre didn't even make it through his whole first season before they did a driver swap, moving Alex Albon up to Red Bull. And then you only have Alex make it the rest of that season and one season after that before he's dropped by Red Bull. Alex is ultimately replaced by Checo Perez. We see Checo make it for a certain amount of time, and then he's dropped at the end of last season, and then we get to where we are now. I go through all of that because I want to point out that while it feels extremely brutal to see these types of moves, Red Bull has never been a team that was against doing this. Red Bull has always been a team that is very much using all of their talent pool while they can, very much treats their junior team as a talent pool for them to pull from, and is known for making these pretty intense, brutal swaps. And it goes back before the time of Max Verstappen. I just use that timeline to really give you the context of where we're at right now. And I think my point here is that we should never be surprised when a team who shows you what their culture is ultimately makes a decision that lines up with that culture. Red Bull is a team that absolutely says you must be excellent all the time and never fail. And the second that you do, we have a roster of drivers who are absolutely available to take your space. If you build a team culture around that, if you build a team that is absolutely so focused on results, but also telling your drivers that if you do not perform, someone will replace you, if you don't actually make the move to replace those drivers, then that threat becomes a very empty threat. And I think these drivers that come into Red Bull and join the Red Bull family, even before they get to Formula One, when they join that Red Bull driver academy and they know that they're moving forward towards being a Red Bull racing driver, hopefully. I also think we have to acknowledge that they know that that is the culture of the team. And while it is definitely brutal, I also think business is business. And Red Bull is one of the very few teams that I feel like does not lean into this, like, we're a family kind of energy. And I don't mean that they don't actually use the word family. I think Christian Horner in particular uses the Red Bull family moniker all the time. I mean that they don't actually feel like that type of workplace that's like, we're all just such a big family. Red Bull is a place that you show up, you do your job, and you have to go to your performance review, and if you fail, you get fired. And that's just how it is. That's the actual culture of that team. And I don't necessarily think we can say one way is good and one way is bad. I think we can say that decisions are, and we can look at those and analyze them individually. But I think when we talk about team culture, we talk about business culture, I think it's really a personal preference if you want your workplace to feel like a workplace where you have friends and family, because ultimately your friends and family are then going to have to fire you if you don't do your job. It may just not feel as public public as this feels, it may just not feel as like mechanical and logical. It may actually make you feel a little bit more emotionally hurt, I think. What I admire about Red Bull is that even if they make the wrong decision, they are very upfront about the way that they run these teams. I don't think there is any confusion coming into a space like this and thinking that like, oh, if I don't do so well, people are going to be really nice to me and everything's going to be fine and I'll just keep my job no matter what. And to some degree, I think having clear expectations is honestly a positive. I just don't know that this is as big of a deal as everyone wanted to make it out to be. And I know that that's probably an unpopular opinion, but that's why we're going to break it down. When it comes to the Liam and the Yuki situation, I think the mistake they actually made was promoting Liam in the first place. But I also think if you go back to the episode where we analyzed that decision where it first came out, the decision made sense in the idea of how Red Bull operates. Do I think Liam was ready to be a Red Bull racing driver? No, I don't. I actually am not sure that Red Bull necessarily thought he was 100% ready to do it either. What I think is that Red Bull was choosing between two drivers that had experience. One was Yuki Tsunoda and one was Liam Lawson. Yuki obviously brought talent and a lot more experience to that seat, but what he also brought was a business complication. Yuki's relationship with Red Bull is very much tied to his relationship with Honda, and Honda is very much leaving Red Bull as an engine supplier at the end of this season. Honda is moving over to Aston Martin, and Ford Performance will be kind of filling that gap while Red Bull starts to make their own powertrains. The thing that's important to understand about all of this is that in Formula One, every driver has some sort of extra thing that gets them into their space that has nothing to do with their talent. For Yuki, Honda is that extra thing. There's more money that comes from Honda because of the fact that they have Yuki Tsunoda in their driver lineup. There are sponsorship opportunities, and that relationship they want to keep positive. Because that Honda relationship is ending, I think Red Bull was looking at this in one very specific way, which is that when that relationship ends, Yuki is still a talented driver, but the little bonus extra that comes from having Yuki's relationship with Honda is now gone. Not only that, but that bonus relationship is moving to a competitive team. I think what Red Bull was looking at was this idea of we have two drivers that we believe are talented, but one of them may have more longevity when it comes to our team as a brand. Yuki brought more experience but was weighed down by that Honda aspect, and Liam didn't have the same amount of experience but did have an extreme loyalty to Red Bull. When you look at Liam's situation, there's not really a way that Liam would have an easy out to go to another team, whereas Yuki does have this ability to have a relationship with Aston Martin moving forward, and also to have that sponsorship money, to have the aspect of Japan. Yuki has a lot to offer a team, which means that Yuki also has a lot of bargaining power at the end of this season when it's time to negotiate his contract. I think when they looked at the talent, they looked at the timesheets, they gave Liam his tests and they gave Yuki his tests. When they looked at all of that information, they ultimately said, talent-wise, we could go one way or the other. Business-wise, Liam edges Yuki out. And so I think we saw them take a risk and put Liam, the less experienced driver, into the harder seat, and we know how that now turned out. Now, when it comes to the swap itself, we have seen reporting that Honda put up a little bit more money for Red Bull when Yuki moved over, especially because that move took place before Japan. Japan is not only Yuki's home race, but it is Honda's home race. And there's a lot of monetary benefit to be gained if Yuki was going to be in that Red Bull seat ultimately to do so before the Japan race. Additionally, I think we should look at some of the things that were kind of said and where we were at coming out of China, moving into Japan and before the swap, because we didn't get to talk about those things because during China, I was violently ill. If you listen to the Australia episode, you can actually probably hear me getting sick as we go through the episode. And I actually lost my voice for 4 days. So that's why we missed China. And now we need to catch up on some of that information. Coming out of China, Liam was already being asked about potentially losing his seat, and specifically about losing his seat to Yuki. As much as I want to feel bad for Liam, because this is a brutal situation, it sucks and whatever, Liam just can't ever really seem to respond to a question from press in a way that is positive and focuses on himself. I get that it's hard to be a young driver, to have your first season in Formula One not going well, to not be performing it the way that you think you could be performing, and to be being asked about it. I don't think that the way that Liam deals with adversity when it comes to other drivers is the right way to deal with it. Last year, we saw him flip off Checo. This year, we've seen him already get into altercations on track. Last year, we saw the same thing. And ultimately, we see him make the wrong decision out of emotion. And when he was asked about Yuki potentially replacing him, he jumped straight down the throat of kind of like, Yuki's never been better than me. We've raced against each other and I've always beat him. And I just think that there's a way to manage your emotions when it comes to business like this. These are not like in-race situations where you're being asked these questions. I know it's media training. I know it's learning how to get through this. And I know, again, young and frustrated with your own performance, but it's never a good look to have an extreme ego when you're actively not doing your job well. It's one thing when you're at the top of your game, when we're talking about championship contenders being interviewed about each other, but when you can't get out of Q1 in one of the best teams on the grid, it is very hard to listen to the attitude, I think. Do I think that they made this driver swap over attitude? No. I think it was out of performance. And I also think we should look at a couple of the things that were said. One of which was that Christian Horner said that they did not want to repeat the mistake that they made with Checo, which was essentially allowing him to finish the season while he was not doing well. Again, this is something we could debate. We know that the car was in a really bad situation. We also know that Checo was not performing anywhere near the capacity of Max. And we also know that Checo brought a lot of money sponsorship-wise, and that was more likely the reason that they allowed him to finish the season. However, Christian Horner also said that they could see the mental toll that this was taking on Liam, and that multiple people from Liam's side of the garage had come up to Christian and told him that they were worried about Liam's response to the situation. I do think that we can see that his kind of mental response to this was not necessarily a strong one. There was a lot of tension in the way that Liam was talking about Yuki and the way that he was dealing with him, and Yuki himself was pretty cool and calm and collected when he was asked about the situation. Obviously easier to be calm, cool, and collected when you are the one who might be getting promoted, but I do think we can say that Liam was definitely not in the best state when he was responding to these questions. I also think when you compare the way that Yuki responded to not getting the seat to the way that Liam responded to potentially losing his seat, the maturity levels are very clearly different. So I wanted to go through all of that because I got a lot of questions about my feelings about the swap, where I was at with it, especially given that I had been pretty clear as to why I thought they chose Liam over Yuki, and that I hoped that Liam would be able to perform. And I do think that maybe if he had been given more time, he may have figured it out. But I also think that the biggest thing Liam needs to do is to learn how to be a bit more mature both on and off track. And this is a similar problem to what Yuki had at the beginning of his career. And I do think that it's possible that by simply switching the two of them, by putting Liam in the same team that taught Yuki how to deal with a lot of those problems that he was having, maybe he has the same kind of turnaround in a few seasons that Yuki himself has had. And whether or not Yuki is able to stay at Red Bull after Honda leaves, I think giving him most of a season to actually improve and work at a high-level team will be good for him overall. It will allow him to see if he actually can hack it at a high-level team, if he's more than mid-grid material, and also show the rest of the grid what he brings to a team when he's able to have the right tools. Plus, any amount of good performance that he has will be really impressive overall, given how much of the conversation is centered on the fact that the car is not where they want it. So as much as I think this is, yes, a brutal situation, only giving a driver 2 races to prove himself sucks, I also kind of think it might be the best thing for both of these drivers. I think it really is going to be good for Yuki, and I think as much as it's going to be sort of tough love for Liam, I think Liam will be in a team that is a little bit more supportive of him, gives him a little bit of ability to take some of that pressure off his chest, and hopefully learn how to handle himself a little bit better in Formula One without that pressure of Red Bull, of Max as your teammate. And maybe this is exactly what both of them need. So obviously the Yuki and Liam swap was probably the biggest story that happened before we got into the racing this weekend, but we also have a couple of other kind of stories that start before the race itself. One of them that I want to get into is Jack Doohan's crash. Jack crashed in FP2, and I've seen a lot of questions about what exactly happened, especially because it was such a big crash. First, I do want to point out that Jack didn't actually get a chance to drive during FP1 because his car was given to a rookie who was doing one of their rookie runs, which we see happen throughout the season. A certain number of practice sessions must be completed by a rookie throughout the year, and they can happen at any point during the year, but Alpine chose to run a rookie during FP1 using Jack's car, which meant that Jack had actually not been on track until FP2. Now, why exactly did he crash? This is actually a pretty simple mistake that he made, but discussing it also gives us a chance to talk about aerodynamics and the amount of precision that you need on a track like this, or really any Formula One track. Suzuka is a track that has 18 turns and a single DRS zone. Now, if you don't know what DRS is, or you've just felt uncomfortable asking what DRS is because of how many jokes people make about it and how they use that as a kind of point that you don't know what you're talking about when it comes to Formula One, we're going to break it down now and you don't have to ever worry about asking again. DRS stands for drag reduction system. And on the back of every Formula One car, we have a rear wing. And on that wing, we have a flap that can open and close. When that flap is opened, it allows the air to actually flow through it as opposed to having to go over it, which reduces the amount of drag on the car, allowing it to go faster. In a racing scenario, DRS can only be used in DRS zones. And in order to be able to use it at the DRS zone, on that lap, you have to be within 1 second of the car in front of you when you get to the DRS detection point. Now, the DRS detection point is before the actual DRS zone, which means that you have to have caught up to that car before we get into that space in order to be able to use that DRS, reduce the drag on your car, and be a little bit faster. This is where you then see overtaking happening, and you also see a lot of radio chatter about whether or not the car behind you is within DRS, whether it's looking close, whether you need to speed up, whether you're going to make it into DRS. All of that chatter comes from that detection point aspect. Now, during a scenario where you are not in a race, like qualifying or free practice, you're able to open DRS regardless of what's going on with the car in in front of you since it doesn't actually matter. Jack's crash happened coming out of that DRS zone and going into turn 1. Jack had DRS open coming into that spot, and that is completely normal for this part of the track. He had DRS open as he was coming through the DRS zone, and everyone else would have done the same thing. The trouble came into the actual turn itself. Jack did not close DRS before he went into the turn. When we look at the telemetry data that came out afterwards, we can see that he does ease off of the gas, but he does not actually tap the brake going into the turn. The problem with that is that he also didn't manually deactivate DRS using his steering wheel, which means that coming into that turn, he still had that flap open, and there was a huge lack of downforce that he needed to make that turn safely. Had he tapped the brake, that would have closed the DRS flap for him, but because he chose not to tap that brake or manually deactivate DRS, it was open, and that's what made that crash look so bad. He tries to turn the car, but there's no downforce pushing him into that space, and he just totally spins around and hits that barrier. It is driver error, it is pretty brutal, and it looked awful when it happened, but he did pass all of his medical checks, and that is what caused the crash. It does suck because he obviously caused a lot of damage, a lot of cost to the team for that. Obviously, it was driver error, which then again comes into a lot of that conversation about who deserves the seat, who should be in it. Alpine is another team that has a ton of reserve drivers, including Franco Colapinto, and they also have had some changes to the team leadership, which also errs on the side of a little bit more brutal. So instantly when you see a driver make a mistake like this, and you see a driver who feels like he's kind of fighting for his life when it comes to his seat, make that type of mistake, we also have a lot of chatter about whether or not he'll be replaced. But I did want to explain what exactly caused that crash, because I think it actually helps understand why these things can be so precise and important. Every one of these drivers is driving at an extreme level in a very fast track, and a little bit of a mistake like that can cause such an intense crash. Otherwise, before the race, we did see that the Ferraris were not performing at a speed that we would have hoped to see. I think on F1 TV, they continually called those laps pretty average. And we also did see Lewis confirm that they had changed the suspension after they had the disqualifications last week, and that they were riding a little bit higher than they would have preferred to. This again does make sense because Lewis's disqualification was because of the suspension of the car. They were running too low to the ground last week, which meant that his skid block, which is a piece that is under every Formula One car that we measure after the race is over, had been degraded too much. All of that really comes down to the fact that the car is running lower to the ground, which allows them to go faster, and that skid block being degraded means that they were running too low, which gave them an unfair advantage, which results in a disqualification. So obviously Ferrari kind of overcorrected for that, and we saw Lewis confirm that, which is why it felt like in free practice and qualifying we weren't really seeing a high level of performance from those cars. It almost felt like a better safe than sorry situation because yes, they did need points this week, but also bummer not to really see them be competitive. Then on the Yuki Liam side of things in qualifying, we see Yuki actually get out qualified by Liam, which sucks. I really was kind of hoping that we would see a large amount of performance from Yuki and that it would be just a no conversation moving forward. However, I do want to point out a couple of things. One, when Yuki was in the V-Carb, he was highly outperforming what Liam did this week. Two, Isack actually very much outperformed both of them, but especially his teammate in a direct comparison. And three, because Q2 was red flagged, one of the decisions we saw Red Bull make was to limit Yuki down to one last lap. Unfortunately, I do think it cost him making it to Q3. Essentially, the reason they would have made this decision is that they were trying to save an extra set of tires, and also to some degree, it meant that they had a lot of trust in Yuki and treated him almost the same way strategically they would have treated Max. In order to save that extra set of softs, they keep him in the garage for longer after the red flag, limiting him down to one real lap that he just wasn't able to connect in the way he needed to move forward. So it's kind of this weird situation because on one hand, strategically, they kind of boned him, but on the other hand, it means that they really had confidence in him as a driver. So I don't know where we'll see that land, but hopefully it means that next week we see a little bit of communication, we see him get what he needs, and also, again, an interrupted session always ends up with these awkward little places, I think. However, obviously, I am a big fan of Yuki, and I would have loved to have seen him just kind of end all conversation. Obviously, I deserve this seat. Obviously, I'm better than Liam. Obviously, I can handle the Red Bull, and obviously, my best performance is going to be at my home race. Like, I would have loved to have seen that be the narrative. It's just not what we ended up with. But I do want to point out that ultimately, even though this was a negative, it does show the confidence that Red Bull has in Yuki as a driver, and I think that is a positive. Also, when we talk about where everyone qualified, one thing that we have to always kind of talk about these weeks, it seems like, is Williams. Alex did a great job, and then we saw Carlos end up with a grid penalty because he impeded Lewis on a flying lap. I've been really impressed with Alex across the last 3 weeks, and I'm really excited because I think overall, this new teammate, this whole new situation, this has really opened Alex up to prove that he is a better competitor than we necessarily thought he was. Getting into Q3 again was just so incredible. Very proud of him, very excited to see what he continues to do in that Williams. And the last thing that we have to talk about before we head into the race itself is, of course, Max setting a new track record and taking his 4th pole position in a row at Suzuka. The lap that we saw from Max in quali to take pole was just honestly nothing short of brilliant. And I think whether you are a fan of Max or not, something that we always see with him are these moments where he reminds you why he is a 4-time world champion. He knows exactly what he's doing in that car. He put everything together and it just hooked up in such a great way. And it was honestly just gorgeous. He set a new track record and he outperformed both McLarens with knowing that we're having problems with this car. And I think we always have to be a little unbiased and give people their props where they're due, because good Lord, that was an incredible lap. So that kind of wraps up everything that happened pre-race that we wanted to talk about. And now let's talk about the race itself, which again, pretty boring. The reason I said at the beginning of this episode that this race could have been an email is that because when we look at the top 10 finishers, there was literally only one place change. Lewis Hamilton passed Isack Hadjar, moving from 8th to 7th, but otherwise positions 1 through 10 are exactly the way that they qualified. There really was not ever a point where it felt like there was very exciting stuff happening, and to some degree, I think we have to blame a little bit of that on McLaren's strategy. I think McLaren had a chance to catch Max if they had done things properly, because when you look at where everything finished and how well the McLaren has been running this entire time, there's no way that at least one of those drivers wouldn't have had a chance to catch them if we had talked about strategy in a very different way. When we talk about McLaren's pit strategy, the thing that really does not seem to make sense is that we bring in Oscar early, but then when we see Max come into pit, we don't leave Lando out to create a tire delta. Generally speaking, what that means is that they would have left Lando out longer, allowing each lap that goes by to mean that he will ultimately have fresher tires than Max for the end of the race, and hopefully be fast enough to overtake him from that P1 position. And then you also have Oscar kind of covered off here to make sure that he is kind of in that space holding up in that podium. But instead, we saw McLaren decide to pit Lando on the exact same lap as Max, which ends up with this sort of Hail Mary attempt to overtake him in the pit lane, which means we then saw him turn his car into a lawnmower. As he was attempting to get out of the pit in front of Max, we see him basically run out of road and end up on the grass. Then he makes his way back in, and then ultimately we never see Lando overtake Max in this race. Part of that is because Max was driving an absolutely beautifully perfect race, but also part of that absolutely had to do with strategy. Again, also I think one of the highlights of this race was radio messages in general, and during this particular incident we get the kind of battle of Max saying that he ran himself into the grass, Lando saying he ran me over into the grass. Ultimately, both of them were only talking to the stewards trying to make sure that they did not get a penalty. Lando hoping that Max would get one, Max trying to make it so clear that Lando was out of his line. Neither of them technically did anything illegal. It just was like a rough attempt at trying to get in front of him. Ultimately, clean racing, it was fine. But it was a situation where I was just like, why is this the decision we're making instead of trying to make a bigger, more informed decision? Having your driver feel like the best way to try to do this was to attempt to overtake in the pit lane. I don't know. It wasn't the best situation. But also one of the things that I did think was funny is that it shows you the advantage of finishing first in the constructors. This was not something that they would have had the ability to even try to do if McLaren was not first. Had Max been first in the pit lane, there wouldn't have been an attempt to overtake because Max simply would have just exited very quickly. So, if we're trying to find something to learn from this race, it is the fact that that is a real advantage. And then the other question in strategy comes back down to, once again, this idea of a number 1 and a number 2 driver in McLaren. At a certain point towards the end of the race, we saw that Oscar was faster than Lando, and that Oscar was asking to be able to swap the cars and attempt to catch Max. In theory, what would have happened is if Oscar had been able to catch Max, he would have won the race, obviously. And if he hadn't been able to catch Max, they would have agreed that he would have swapped the cars back, giving Lando that position back and finishing second. Instead, we never see them swap the cars at all. We see Lando in certain points of the track where he was outperforming Max get caught up, but not get close enough to actually be able to execute the move, and never get close enough to be able to execute a move in DRS. I think this decision is kind of a complicated one because we didn't hear all of the radio that would have been discussed. We did hear enough of it to feel like, okay, our competitors are hearing this sort of back and forth argument, and it's still clear to everyone that the thing that kept us from winning last year in terms of the Drivers' Championship, this inability to decide that we're supporting one driver over everyone else, that is still there clearly. But what we don't know is the conversation that they were having, because Oscar is not super far behind Lando right now in those driver standings. So if you play the scenario out and say that they did swap the cars, say that Oscar caught Max and Oscar won the race, that would have put Lando Lando in third. And that point swap, I believe, would have meant that Oscar was in the lead for the championship and Lando would have been behind. However, the difference here is if Max wins the race, which is what he ultimately did, and Lando stays second, he is still in the lead for the championship by 1 point. Now, do I think Lando was sitting there in the cockpit having this argument and doing that exact math and knowing the very specific numbers? Not necessarily, no, but I do think he knew those numbers coming in. And I also think both Lando and Oscar understand that the other is a big threat to their championship dreams. And Oscar is holding his own when it comes to this situation. So for Lando overall, especially given what happened last season and the way the team didn't necessarily fully jump in early enough for him to win that driver's championship, he has to be thinking on some level, if Oscar passes him in the championship, Oscar will become the priority. Lando has to hold that berth. And we don't know how much of that conversation was happening, how much of that conversation happened after, how much of that conversation happened before. But what we do know is that neither Lando nor Oscar believe that the other one should get a championship before them. That's just sort of how competing works. So I think the thing about this swap specifically is that while it is possible that Oscar would have passed Max and that they would have gotten a race win, and that if he hadn't, they could have always swapped the cars back, I think mentally this team has a lot to deal with in terms of recovering from last year, figuring out which of their drivers is the number one driver, who gets prioritized and what that means. And in a scenario where Oscar had then won that race, Lando immediately becomes defensive. Lando immediately has to figure out how to prove he's the one who deserves the number one slot. And Oscar continues to argue that he clearly is in the lead. And I think that makes the whole situation much more complicated. And so for the team, this may have been the right decision. Don't create a bigger issue for yourself, but sacrifice a win in this capacity, knowing that they are still dealing with their second driver, meaning Red Bull is still figuring out, can Yuki perform? They've made this big change. I don't think they feel under threat for constructors. And it is just this conversation of, can Lando beat Max? Can Oscar beat Max? Is Max going to win again? But Lando is holding that first position of driver's champion, and I hope that they are correcting in some capacity for the way that they ran everything last year. So this could have been almost an overcorrection. Strategically, yeah, I think they should have swapped the cars and seen if Oscar could have caught Max. A win is a win, etc., etc. But the thing is, if you're looking at it from a long-term standpoint of team management, of driver management, figuring out what works for you, do you lose goodwill with Lando and have a situation later on where you do need him to be a team player and him not feel like he wants to? Do you manage the situation by putting Lando where he stays, telling Oscar that the best way to do this is to keep it the way that they are and manage everything in the best way? And then additionally, there's this argument that because of the pit strategy, Oscar maybe had a little bit of an advantage, given that Lando's tire degradation was a little bit different in the way that he was running behind Max. I just think that you actually kind of put yourself in this situation, you being McLaren, where you lose the ability to kind of negotiate with your drivers and this goodwill that you want to have to be able to make decisions down the line when they're higher stakes. Right now, leaving the podium the way that they did, sacrificing a win to Max, leaving Lando in the position where he's still in front for the Constructors' Championship and Oscar is still competitive. This was, I think, maybe the best way for them to manage things moving forward. Creates less drama, less tension, potentially slates things a little in Lando's favor, but also gives a little bit of goodwill to say that they owe Oscar a choice. I'm not sure. I do think that last year, one of their biggest troubles was this management of drivers and egos and managing who was important and who wasn't and figuring out who was going to win a driver's championship, all these different things. I'm hopeful, maybe a little too hopeful, that this was a scenario where they were trying to fix the problems that they had last year, and it results in what we saw, which ultimately is not a huge mistake unless we felt like Oscar was going to be the one who is a championship contender. However, this would be one of those mistakes that you look back on like we did last year, where we say swapping the cars and the point differential is the reason why Lando didn't beat Max this year. I think maybe we're overcorrecting, looking at their long run, and probably looking at this idea of Lando being world champion. And how do we focus on that and make sure that it happens this year? So that's just my 2 cents. Obviously, my name is not Andrea Stella or Zach Brown. I don't know what happened. I don't know why they made the choices that they made. I do know that I disagree with the pit choices, and I think that they could have had a stronger end if they hadn't gone that way. But ultimately, it's one race. And I hope that we're seeing a little bit better management of team egos, driver egos, figuring out what makes the most sense. Like I said, the majority of this race went completely unchanged. And so I did feel like one of the more exciting parts of this was the radio messages. We did have another kind kind of tension moment between Lewis Hamilton and his engineer as they continue to have growing pains figuring out their communication style. We also had the return of sassy Charles Leclerc, but honestly, I think the best radio messages in terms of entertainment value came from Alex Albon. Later in interviews post-race when he was asked about it, he was like, wow, it must have been a really boring race, and he seemed a little embarrassed by the way that he had spoken to his engineer, but my god, was he crashing out. Look, I have really been enjoying Alex and his performance this season, and I think I said at the beginning of this season that Carlos becoming his teammate has made Alex a better driver. I think that comes from the fact that you have a bigger amount of kind of competition right at your doorstep, which requires you automatically to be a stronger driver or to fail under the pressure. As soon as the Carlos Sainz announcement was made, we saw very many people from fans to pundits to journalists saying that there was no way Alex could compete with Carlos, that Carlos would show up and the entire team would become formed around him, and that he would absolutely be the only person who mattered to Williams. And apart from James Vowles kind of overly praising Carlos, talking about how beautiful his hair was and all these different things, I think we've actually seen that Alex has overperformed in terms of what he was doing last year and has really shown that he wants to remain the focus of this team. And I think that that's great. I think that sometimes when you don't have competition, you become a lesser version of yourself purely because you don't have to actually be better. For Alex, he automatically had an insane amount of pressure this season, and that has resulted in him having points every single race at the start of this season. And I think that's great. So when it comes to him fully crashing out over the radio, calling his team ridiculous and trying to figure out what was wrong, I think I'm going to give him a pass, mostly because I was very looking for entertainment this race and he provided a little bit of it. And apart from the top 10 of the race, we also had the back half of the grid. Unfortunately, we saw Lance Stroll, who's actually been performing pretty well, even compared to Alonso and his failure this season, really fail at quali and just never really be able to dig himself out of that. This was a race where we saw all 20 cars actually finish, which is a little bit different. And then one of the things that I do want to talk about is the potential of two of these rookies that have really emerged. We have 6 rookies this season when we include Liam Lawson, and so far we've already seen one of those rookies, Liam, be demoted from his own position. We've seen DNFs, we've seen a lack of points, but there are 2 rookies that I think have really been showing out, and those are Kimi Antonelli and Isack Hadjar. I think Kimi himself had a very high level of pressure coming into this season, and he's lived up to it in a very surprising way to me. I kind of expected him to have a fully rough first half of this season, and instead what we've seen is that even though George Russell is outperforming him, Kimi is quite close behind him. We saw him really perform well in a rainy race, and then this weekend we saw him become the youngest driver to ever lead a Formula One race, to manage his tires extremely well, and to qualify and finish right behind his teammate, George Russell. I think Kimi is such a strong driver, and I also think the fact that he's not having a terrible adjustment period means that there is so much potential to come. The fact that he's diving in, feels very comfortable on the radio, and feels very comfortable behind the wheel is right behind his current teammate, George Russell, who has a lot of success in the sport and a lot of experience, and also sometimes I think has this kind of childlike excitement on the radio where it almost feels like we all can't believe that this is happening, but still maintaining the strong understanding of the sport and what he needs to do. I think Kimi really, really knows what he's doing and is going to perform potentially to this high level that we all expected him to. But what is particularly lovely to see with Kimi is the fact that he seems to be able to manage to keep himself level-headed and to still be enjoying himself despite the amount of pressure. This week we saw him talk about the fact that he is still going to high school, and that not only is he going to school in between race weekends, but it's really important to his mom that he finishes, and we also saw him drive a very good race. I think with Kimi, it could have gone one of 2 ways. He could have come in with all of this pressure and completely crashed out, or he could have done what he's doing now, which is building this very solid base for himself. And I think by the end of the season, especially as he's getting his bearings, he's going to start to become a threat. And depending on how that Mercedes car looks for 2026 and the new regulations, it could be very interesting to see where everything shakes out. But then there's also Isack Hadjar. And I think Isack is honestly really outperforming his expectations. Obviously, we know he had a devastating start to his season in Australia where he crashed during the formation lap. We saw that very tender moment between him and Lewis Hamilton's father, but then the next week we saw him get right back on track and focus. And then this week, I think honestly, because of how unexciting the race is, it's easy to forget how well he performed, making it to Q3 and qualifying 7th and finishing in the points, and doing all of that with a car that is not a top form car, I think is really exciting. And when we talk about Red Bull in this space where we say they have 4 drivers on the track at all times, something that's interesting to note is that Isack was the 2nd highest Red Bull driver, including the main team. If we look at that ranking, it was Max, then Isack, then Yuki, then Liam. So I think Isack has a lot of potential. And I also think that that's another person to keep your eye on for that potential Red Bull future. I think Red Bull is in this conversation right now where they built their entire team around Max and their entire future around Max, and we don't know how long Max will will stay. There hasn't really seemed to be an answer as to what happens next with Red Bull once Max decides to leave and once the Max Verstappen era of that team is over. Isack, I think, is starting to show the type of potential where we look at him and say, could this be the future of Red Bull? And quite frankly, I think coming into this season, I was not super excited about him as a driver just based off of his behavior from F2 and certain things like that, but almost instantly he has genuinely won me over. He's a great driver. I think it takes an extreme amount of mental toughness to be able to come back from the type of opening that he had at Australia and perform in the way that he is. And honestly, he's funny and his personality is quite genuine and adorable and fun. So I am enjoying Isack, and I think I'm excited to track the rest of where he goes and how this looks for him and the future of Red Bull. And then obviously Max takes home the win, and in that takes home his 4th consecutive win at Suzuka. Overall, this drive was a masterclass from Max, and I think honestly, even when we take out the fact that there wasn't a lot of excitement on track, we do have to acknowledge how much of an incredibly good drive it was, and where it was one of those moments where it felt like, there's Max Verstappen, there he is. I think right now the Red Bull is just not up to par, which honestly makes this drive from Max even more impressive than the rest of his dominant era. The season before last and last season for the beginning half, so much of Max and Red Bull's dominance had come down to they have a rocket ship, how could you lose? Now we're getting to see this Max that has to compete. And I think actually getting to hear the sheer joy in his voice this weekend, where he's winning, but winning after actually heavily competing and having to fight for it, this is the type of Max that is really fun to watch. I think sometimes in sports it can end up being boring to watch someone just be so much better than everyone else, and for a team to be functioning at a point where nobody thinks that they can even hold a candle to them. Sports are about competition and story, and when you lose that, it can be a little less exciting. But Max this weekend was absolutely a story of return to triumph, and you can hear that excitement, that emotion, and that genuine joy that comes from driving in a Formula One race for Max. I really enjoyed it. I was really happy to see it, and I think even despite the fact that maybe the race itself I didn't love, I was happy to hear Max kind of sounding this great and this happy. So that was the race, and we do have a couple of things to talk about from post-race. One, on the funnier side, Carlos Sainz was fined 20,000 euros for missing the national anthem. Now, it's a normal thing if you don't show up to the national anthem, you do get fined, and typically that fine is 60,000 euros. However, Carlos did answer why he missed the national anthem, and that was because he was locked in the bathroom with a little bit of hot girl tummy issues. Not only did he disclose this information, but he also sent in a doctor's note that did verify that this is what was happening. I am very politely talking around the fact that Carlos Sainz was absolutely locked in a bathroom with gastrointestinal distress during the national anthem, and that's why he missed it. But despite the fact that he literally had a doctor confirm this, the FIA still decided to fine him. Instead of 60,000, they fined him 20,000 due to the fact that he had actually provided a doctor's note and an excuse, and 10,000 of that was due now, and 10,000 of it was deferred pending any other infractions. But I think this is where a lot of that tension comes between the drivers and the FIA. So many of their fines make no sense, and some of them, like this, really feel like there is actually no reason for it other than to be cruel. I'm not sure what their preferred version of this would have been. I think there's probably something worse that could have happened if Carlos had done what he was doing in the bathroom on the grid while the national anthem was going down. Additionally, I'm not sure if we've talked about this on the show before, but we've definitely talked about it on TikTok and Instagram. Unlike other sports, the FIA does not disclose where these fines go. Many other professional sports like the NBA and the NFL and the NHL, all of those actually very clearly disclose where all of the fines go. So when the player is actually fined, that money goes into a fund, and depending on the league, there's different ways that that money is spent. A lot of times there's a charitable aspect. Sometimes some of that money goes into funds that help players later in life when they need it. There's a lot of different ways, but all of those are very clearly disclosed. The FIA does not disclose that at all. The money's taken from the drivers, goes to the FIA, and then they never hear about it again. And I think specifically because of that, and then because of moments like this where someone is being fined for something that's absolutely out of their control and following the rules would have been worse, I think that's where you get this tension between driver and regulatory body. And I think it's pretty warranted in this scenario. One of you guys on social media actually said that if you had to disclose and get a doctor's note and tell everyone that you had been trapped in the bathroom and you still got fined, there would be hell to pay. And you know what? I agree. But I am curious how you guys feel about the FIA fines, because for me, I do think fines of players is fine. We're saying fine a lot, but I think it's acceptable for leagues to fine their players for types of things like behavior that's dangerous or things that make the league look overall bad. But I also think things like this, where it's over the line of what's normal or acceptable, this should have been an exception. And then on the other end, and additionally, I think it's fine when these leagues are disclosing where the money goes. And also when there are clear kind of delineations explanations of why it would be fined, what's not acceptable, what is acceptable, what you can get away with, and where there are exceptions to be made. I think fines in that sense are acceptable. I think fines with the FIA where you don't know where any of the money is going and there seems to be just a desire to control doesn't really make sense to me, and I think there needs to be some adjustments there. And then another piece of information that did come out in post-race press conferences is Lewis Hamilton mentioned that they did figure out what is wrong with his car. Overall, whatever issue they have defined, he stated has been costing him a 10th per lap, which is pretty extreme when you actually add all of that up. So with that being said, I am hopeful that whatever they're changing this week means that next week we'll see improved performance from Lewis Hamilton. I think that pretty much wraps up everything that happened at Suzuka, so let's get into your questions, comments, and hot takes and predictions for next week. Okay, first we've got 4 races, 4 winners. How likely do you think that this will continue? 16 and 63 are still potential winners. I definitely think that this is going to continue. I think we're going to see a pretty competitive and interesting season, though my prediction is that I do think at a certain point mid-season-ish, McLaren is going to start to take over and really get dominant. They are already kind of dominant. Obviously, we had Lando win the first race, Oscar won the second, and Max won the third. This comment actually specifically highlights George Russell and Charles Leclerc as the potential winners that we haven't seen yet. And I do see that, but I actually think that we're going to see those two really compete with their teammates as their teammates get comfortable. So for George Russell, Kimi Antonelli, as he continues to grow with Mercedes and become more and more comfortable, have his mentorship from Valtteri Bottas, I think that we're going to see Kimi become more of a threat to George, which could then kind of compete in the way that we run strategy at Mercedes. And I think the same is to be said for Charles Leclerc at Ferrari. I think as Lewis gets more comfortable with the car, as they adjust it, I think you're going to start to see some of that confusion of which of them is a more dominant driver at the team and who is going to compete a little bit higher. And I think for both pairs, we could see that affect who wins first and why. Regardless, though, I think it's been a long time since we've been able to talk about this many teams that have this many potential winners in them. And I do think that we're going to continue to see a shakeup. I don't think we're going to see one driver or one team win every single race this season, which is great. That's the best type of Formula One, in my opinion. How do you see Lando's pit lane triad and overtake? I think it was kind of dangerous. I know we talked about this during the episode, but I wanted to answer the question specifically about the idea of danger. I don't think it was dangerous. I think that essentially he went over the grass. We knew that the grass was wet from the rain the day before or the day of. I know the track essentially had been wet from the rain earlier on, but both Max and Lando know what they're doing. And honestly, it wasn't ever a situation where Lando turned into him. I think the fact that he did go into the grass meant that he was just taking a risk that he ultimately bailed out of. Had he been turning into Max to the point that Max was the one who had to move off track, that could have been a situation where it did feel a little bit more dangerous. But this really, if you look at the replay, they really are just parallel the entire time. And Lando is actually a little bit behind him as they come out. So I think it was a calculated risk, but I also think it was a risk that wouldn't have had to have been taken if McLaren had pitted Lando at the right time. Thoughts on how the Oscar-Lando team dynamic will go? I think Lando is ultimately going to be the one who gets priority. I think this because I think this week showed it. Honestly, I may be a little biased, but I kind of want to see Lando win a championship before Oscar. I think Lando really has put the energy in, and I really do think that this season he came in and fixed the one issue that he had, which was sort of like his mentality around this. I think he has been a little bit too much of a people pleaser, and I think that that is part of what caused the team dynamic issues at last season. I think because he was so willing to do what he was told and so willing to be a team player, and Oscar is as well, but with the expectation of eventually being the one who takes over, kind of playing that quiet long game that he's hoping will get shorter and shorter. I think that's part of where we saw these issues come in. And I think if Lando can focus in and stay and believe that he is the priority and hold that position, I think it's possible that this year is his year. And I really would like to see that stay. And then we have Kimi gets a lot of deserved praise, but Isack Hadjar is Rookie of the Year material. I actually agree with that. I really think I talked a little bit about how much I think Isack has potential and how beautiful I think his career could be. And I think Rookie of the Year could be a real conversation, especially if he continues to hit the points and continues to compete with Kimi in this way, but is doing so in an objectively subpar car. Mark Webber is working overtime to hold McLaren to the no second driver cause. This actually I kind of agree with. You never know what's going on behind closed doors. For those who don't know, Mark Webber is not only Oscar Piastri's manager, but also a former Formula One driver himself. And I definitely think that there is part of that conversation that is causing so much turmoil of who's in charge and who's going to be more prioritized at McLaren has to do with that relationship. Max is 1 point away from the championship driving what might be a tractor. Yeah, I think this was actually a very impressive run from him. And I think it actually, when you look at last season, adjusts the way that we look at maybe Checo's performance and Max's performance himself. If the car is as troubled as it seems to be, I think what it's showing is how strong of a driver Max Max is, and it continues to do so in a way where we are able to say it's not just the car, it is definitely Max Verstappen. In terms of predictions for the next race, I think we're going to see, hopefully, a change in the Ferrari performance, a continued success from Alex Albon, and I think I'm going to say this is more of a hopeful situation than really anything backed by fact. I think we're going to see McLaren actually lock in on Lando Norris. I think if they are willing to focus on Lando and make that commitment, then I actually think that they will lock in and take both the drivers and the constructors championship this season. I think the only thing that could keep McLaren from doing that is if they allow interpersonal drama to take the focus of this season. So we are back next week in Bahrain, and until then, if you have any questions about this race, or if you have any questions about Formula One in general that you'd like me to cover, or if you just want to let me know what you thought about the race, you can always find me in a couple of different ways. One, you can find this podcast on YouTube, and you can always connect with me in the comments section. You can obviously make sure you are subscribed wherever you're listening to this podcast, whether that's YouTube or Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcast app. And you can always find me on social media, on TikTok, Threads, and Instagram. I am at Marissa Kamari. And if you're looking for a way to have a little bit more community when it comes to the way that you watch Formula One, you can always join our Discord server for the grid chat. You can do that in the link in the episode description, which I will put below. And once you join, we keep up on things that are going on throughout the week. We have our own fantasy Formula One league. And of course, we watch the races together over chat. So be sure to click the link in the episode description down below to join the grid chat. And I will see you next Monday to recap Bahrain.